I used to believe that marriages begin the moment the bride enters the house. That day, when I stepped inside his family home, I told myself that whatever waited for me beyond that door was now my destiny. The house was large, quiet, and polished, too polished, as if emotions were wiped away along with dust. Everyone smiled, but their smiles felt rehearsed, like lines practiced in front of mirrors. I noticed it, but I ignored it. I was taught that doubt on the first day was a bad omen. My husband stood beside me, dressed perfectly, greeting guests with confidence. People admired him openly. They called him responsible, successful, lucky. He barely looked at me. When he did, it was brief, almost distracted, like I was a task he had already completed. I told myself he was nervous. I told myself love shows differently for different people. That was the first lie I told myself to survive the day. His mother took my hand and led me through the house, explaining rules gently, politely. What time tea was served. Which room was whose. How guests should be treated. She spoke softly, but there was something firm underneath her words, something that did not invite questions. I nodded at everything. I wanted to be good. I wanted to belong. I didn't realize that belonging in that house meant disappearing. That night, when the guests finally left and the lights dimmed, I waited for him to talk to me, to ask me how I was feeling, to say anything that made me feel chosen. Instead, he checked his phone, poured himself a drink, and said he was tired. He fell asleep with his back turned to me. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the unfamiliar silence of a house that didn't feel like mine. In the following days, small things began to feel heavy. Meals where conversations stopped when I entered. Laughter that resumed only after I left the room. His sister watching me closely, then smiling too quickly when I looked back. His mother correcting me in front of others, always politely, always with a smile that said I should be grateful. I told myself this was adjustment. Everyone says the first few months are hard. He came home late most nights. When I asked, he said work was stressful. When I waited with dinner, he said he wasn't hungry. Sometimes he smelled like alcohol. Sometimes like a perfume that wasn't mine. When I asked again, gently, he laughed and said I worried too much. Don't be like that, he told me. You're imagining things. I started calling my mother less. I didn't want her to hear the tiredness in my voice. I didn't want her to worry. Whenever she asked if I was happy, I said yes quickly, before my voice could betray me. I believed that if I said it often enough, it would become true. At night, alone in that large room, I would replay the day in my head, wondering what I had done wrong. Was I too quiet? Too emotional? Not grateful enough? I promised myself I would try harder the next day. I didn't know then that no amount of trying could fix a place where I was never meant to be protected. There were things I didn't know yet. Things everyone else knew. Truths buried under money, respect, and carefully maintained silence. But at that time, all I felt was a strange emptiness growing inside me, slow, quiet, and patient. And I had no idea how much it would take from me before anyone noticed. After the wedding celebrations faded, life settled into a routine that didn't feel like living. Days passed quietly, but the quiet wasn't peaceful. It pressed against my chest, heavy and unspoken. Every morning I woke up before everyone else, unsure why, as if my body was already trained to stay alert. I helped in the kitchen, cleaned rooms that never felt dirty, and tried to learn the rhythm of a house that didn't include me in its heartbeat. My mother-in-law watched everything. Not openly, not sharply, but carefully. If I added too much salt to the food, she corrected it later in front of others, laughing softly. If I spoke too little, she told relatives I was shy. If I spoke too much, she said I was immature. There was no right way to exist. I learned to smile through it, because smiling kept the air calm. My husband became a shadow I lived with. Present, yet unreachable. He left early and returned late. Some nights he didn't return at all. When I asked, his answers were vague, careless. You worry too much. You think too much. Once, when I asked if he was happy, he looked at me like I had asked something foolish. Why wouldn't I be, he said, and turned away. I stopped asking after that. His sister often sat with me in the afternoons. She asked questions about my family, my education, my habits. At first, I thought she wanted to know me. Later, I realized she wanted to measure me. Every answer I gave seemed to be stored somewhere, repeated later in twisted ways. I would hear my own words come back to me differently, shaped into stories I never told. I felt myself shrinking. I stopped wearing the clothes I liked. I stopped laughing loudly. I stopped sharing my thoughts. It felt safer to disappear slowly than to stand out even once. Whenever I felt overwhelmed, I reminded myself that marriages need patience, that good wives endure quietly, that love grows with time, but something inside me was already tired. One evening, I noticed empty bottles hidden in the cupboard near his room. My hands trembled as I touched them. I remembered the smell of alcohol on his breath, the way his voice changed at night. When I asked him about it, he laughed again. "Don't act innocent," he said. "Everyone drinks." That night, he came home drunk. He didn't shout. He didn't hit. He simply ignored me completely, as if I wasn't there. That hurt more than anger would have. I sat on the edge of the bed until morning, holding my knees, listening to my own breathing, so I wouldn't cry too loudly. I wanted to go home. The thought came suddenly, clearly. But it scared me. What would I say? That I was lonely? That my husband didn't love me? That his family didn't see me as human? None of it sounded serious enough when I imagined saying it out loud. So I stayed. A few weeks later, I found out I was pregnant. I stared at the test for a long time, waiting to feel joy. Instead, fear washed over me. I told him that evening, carefully, choosing my words as if they were fragile glass. He nodded, said okay, and poured himself another drink. No smile. No questions. No warmth. That was the moment I understood something important. I was carrying a life inside me, but I was still completely alone, and somewhere deep inside, a quiet voice whispered that this house was not going to protect either of us. Pregnancy did not soften anything in that house. If anything, it made my presence more inconvenient. My body began to change, slowly at first, then all at once. Nausea followed me through the mornings, dizziness through the afternoons, and exhaustion clung to me like a second skin. Still, the expectations stayed the same. I was supposed to wake early, help in the kitchen, smile at relatives, and pretend that nothing inside me was struggling. When I told my mother-in-law about the nausea, she frowned lightly and said women in her time worked through much worse. She reminded me that weakness invites problems. I stopped mentioning my discomfort after that. I learned to sit quietly when my head spun and to excuse myself silently when my hands began to shake. No one noticed. Or maybe they noticed and chose not to care. My husband grew more distant. Some nights he didn't come home at all. Other nights he returned late, smelling of alcohol, his eyes empty and impatient. I stopped waiting up for him, but sleep never came easily. I lay awake listening for the sound of his footsteps, not because I missed him, but because silence felt unsafe. When he did speak to me, it was brief and sharp. He complained about small things. Food. Noise. My questions. My presence. One afternoon, I asked him to come with me to the doctor. My voice was careful, almost apologetic. He sighed loudly and said he was busy. When I insisted softly, he snapped. "Why do you make everything so difficult?" he said. My mother had children without doctors running after her. I went alone. The hospital smelled of disinfectant and unfamiliar fear. I sat among other women, some with their husbands beside them, some holding hands, some laughing nervously. I watched them quietly, wondering what it felt like to be supported. When the doctor asked if everything was okay at home, I smiled automatically and said yes. The word came easily. Too easily. At home, his sister began visiting more often. She sat close to me, asking how I was feeling, whether I was sleeping well, whether I missed my parents. Her voice was soft, her eyes curious. Sometimes I caught her watching me when she thought I wasn't looking, as if she was waiting for me to say something wrong. Later, I would hear comments whispered through the house. That I was too emotional. That pregnancy had made me unstable. That I cried for no reason. I started doubting myself. My body felt heavier every day, but my place in the house felt lighter, less important. Meals were planned without asking me. Decisions were made without informing me. When relatives visited, I was introduced last, if at all. My husband rarely spoke to me in front of others. When he did, it was to correct me. One evening, I overheard my mother-in-law telling someone on the phone that I was sensitive and not very strong. She laughed softly as she said it, like it was a harmless observation. I stood behind the door, my hand pressed against my stomach, feeling something break quietly inside me. I thought of my parents often then. My mother's voice. My father's silence that always meant safety. I wanted to call them, to tell them everything. But every time I picked up the phone, guilt stopped me. I didn't want to be the reason they worried. I didn't want to admit that I had failed at keeping my marriage together. Late one night, after another argument that wasn't really an argument, just his words and my silence, I sat alone on the bed and cried until my chest hurt. I whispered apologies to the life inside me, promising that things would get better. I didn't know how, but I believed they had to. What I didn't know was that this was only the beginning. That there were truths hidden in that house, buried under years of silence and money. And that my weakness, the one they all saw so clearly, was slowly turning into something else entirely. As my pregnancy progressed, my body demanded rest, but the house demanded obedience. Every ache I felt was treated like an inconvenience. If I sat down for too long, my mother-in-law would glance at me and remind me how staying active kept the mind disciplined. If I moved too slowly, she would sigh and say pregnancy was not an illness. I began to feel guilty for every moment my body failed to cooperate. My husband's absence became routine. Sometimes days passed without a real conversation between us. He left early, returned late, or not at all. When he was home, his phone mattered more than anything else. I watched him laugh at messages, smile at screens, pour drinks without hesitation. Those smiles never reached me. When I asked where he had been, he accused me of questioning him. When I stayed quiet, he accused me of being cold. There was no safe choice. One evening, he came home drunk and angry. Not violent, just sharp and careless. His words cut without effort. He complained about expenses, about responsibility, about how marriage had changed his life. I sat there silently, my hands resting on my stomach, feeling smaller with every sentence. When I reminded him quietly that I was pregnant, he scoffed and said I was using it as an excuse. That night, I locked myself in the bathroom and cried until my face burned. I looked at my reflection and barely recognized the woman staring back. My eyes were dull, my shoulders slumped, my voice gone. I wondered when I had stopped feeling like a person and started feeling like a burden. A few days later, I fainted in the kitchen. I remember the sound of utensils hitting the floor and the sudden rush of voices around me. Someone helped me up, someone gave me water, someone said it was because I didn't eat properly. No one asked why. No one asked how long I had been feeling unwell. When I suggested seeing a doctor, my mother-in-law said rest would fix everything. Rest never came. At night, I lay awake feeling the baby move, tiny reminders of life inside me. Those moments scared me more than they comforted me. I worried about bringing a child into a house where silence was survival. I worried about raising someone in a place where love was conditional and weakness was punished. Then, one afternoon, something happened that shifted everything. A distant relative visited unexpectedly. She looked at me for a long moment, her eyes lingering on my face, my hands, the way I stood. She asked quietly if I was okay. The question caught me off guard. My throat tightened. I almost told her the truth. Almost. But before I could answer, my mother-in-law interrupted, laughing lightly, saying I was just emotional because of pregnancy. The relative nodded, but her eyes didn't soften. Later that night, I heard raised voices behind closed doors. My husband arguing with his mother. His name mentioned sharply. A word I had never heard before slipped through the cracks, something about the past, about mistakes, about hiding things properly this time. When the voices stopped, silence fell again, heavier than before. I sat on the bed, my heart racing, replaying that single sentence over and over. Hiding what? This time compared to when? My mind filled with questions I didn't dare ask. For the first time, I felt it clearly. There was something about my husband's life that I didn't know. Something everyone else did. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I stared at the dark ceiling, listening to the house breathe around me, realizing that my pain was not an accident. It was a pattern, a carefully controlled one. And somewhere within that pattern was a truth that explained everything. I didn't know it yet, but I had just stepped onto a path that would change the meaning of my silence forever. After that night, I began to notice things I had once ignored. Small details that now felt deliberate. Conversations that stopped when I entered the room. Looks exchanged quietly between my husband and his mother. His sister whispering something into his ear and then glancing at me, as if measuring how much I had heard. I started to feel like a guest in my own life, present but never included. My body continued to weaken. The doctor warned me to rest, to avoid stress, to eat properly. I nodded and agreed, knowing none of it would happen. At home, my meals were monitored, my movements questioned. If I ate less, it was my fault. If I ate more, I was careless. There was always something wrong with me, something that needed correction. One evening, I gathered the courage to ask my husband again for support. I told him I felt unwell, that I needed him with me sometimes. He listened impatiently, eyes fixed on his phone. When I finished speaking, he laughed softly and said I was dramatic. "My family is already doing enough for you," he said. "Don't create problems." That word, problems, followed me everywhere after that. Any discomfort I expressed became a problem. Any question I asked became a problem. Even my silence became a problem. I stopped sharing my feelings entirely. A few weeks later, his sister accidentally left her phone on the table. A message lit up the screen. I didn't intend to look, but my eyes caught a sentence before I could stop myself. It mentioned my husband's name and something about last time and mistakes. My heart started racing. When she returned and noticed my expression, she quickly grabbed the phone and smiled too brightly. "Just family stuff," she said. That night, I asked my husband directly if there was anything about his past I should know. His face changed instantly. The calm disappeared, replaced by irritation. He accused me of snooping, of imagining things, of listening to gossip. His mother joined the conversation soon after, telling me that digging into the past only destroys marriages. "What matters is now," she said firmly. "And now you should focus on your child." The discussion ended there. But my mind didn't. I began remembering moments that suddenly made sense. Relatives who had looked at me with pity instead of happiness. Comments about me being simple and adjustable. The way his family had rushed the marriage, avoiding questions, dismissing concerns. I realized I had never seen old photos of him with a partner. I had never heard stories about his life before me. The realization didn't come with anger. It came with fear. One afternoon, my health worsened suddenly. Dizziness overtook me, and I collapsed onto the bed, gasping for air. I called my husband repeatedly. He didn't answer. When he finally returned late that night, I was still lying there, weak and shaking. He looked at me briefly and asked what I had done to myself now. Something inside me cracked. I called my mother for the first time in months. I didn't explain everything. I couldn't. I just told her I was tired. Too tired. Her voice changed immediately. She asked if I wanted to come home for a few days. I hesitated, then said yes. When I told my mother-in-law about it, she smiled politely and said short visits were fine, as long as I didn't exaggerate things. My husband didn't object. He barely noticed. I packed a small bag that night. My hands trembled. I wasn't running away. I wasn't planning anything dramatic. I just needed air. But somewhere deep inside, I felt it clearly. Once I stepped out of that house, things would never feel the same again, because distance has a way of revealing truths that silence hides. Going back to my parents' house felt strange, like returning to a place I no longer fully belonged to, yet desperately needed. My mother noticed everything immediately, the way I moved slowly, the shadows under my eyes, the way I flinched at sudden sounds. She didn't ask questions right away. She just made me sit, made me eat, made me rest. That quiet care broke something inside me. I cried that night without hiding, my face buried in my pillow like a child. For a few days, I slept. Real sleep. The kind where your body lets go because it finally feels safe. My parents didn't push me to talk. They watched me instead. My mother rubbed oil into my hair. My father sat nearby in silence, his presence heavy and reassuring. I realized how long it had been since anyone had taken care of me without expecting something in return. My husband didn't call the first day. Or the second. On the third day, he sent a short message asking when I was coming back. No concern. No questions about my health. Just a reminder that my absence was being noticed because it disrupted routine. I stared at the message for a long time before replying that I needed a little more rest. He didn't respond. At night, memories from his house replayed themselves in my mind, sharper now that I was away. Things I had ignored felt louder. His anger. His drinking. His mother's control. His sister's careful words. The sentence I had overheard about hiding things this time. My chest tightened whenever I thought about it. I wondered what kind of truth required that much protection. One afternoon, my aunt visited. She looked at me closely, then asked gently if everything was okay in my marriage. I opened my mouth to lie, but the words didn't come. Tears filled my eyes instead. That was all it took. My mother asked everyone to leave the room, then sat beside me. Tell me, she said quietly. I tried. I really did. But my story came out in pieces. I told her about the loneliness, the neglect, the drinking, the fear. I didn't know how to explain the rest, the feeling that something was wrong, deeply wrong, even if I couldn't name it. My mother listened without interrupting. When I finished, she held my hands tightly and said something I hadn't heard in a long time. None of this is your fault. The next day, my father made a few phone calls. Not angrily, calmly. He asked questions. He listened more than he spoke. By evening, his face had changed. He didn't tell me what he had learned, but I could feel the weight of it in his silence. That night, I heard my parents whispering behind closed doors, their voices low and tense. 2 days later, my husband showed up unannounced. He walked in like nothing had happened, complaining about traffic, asking why I wasn't answering his calls. My mother offered him tea politely. My father sat across from him, quiet and watchful. When my husband said it was time for me to come home, my father looked at him and asked a simple question. Why didn't you tell us about your first marriage? The room went silent. My husband's face drained of color. He laughed nervously, said it was a misunderstanding, something small, something from the past. My father didn't raise his voice. He simply said he knew the truth. About the divorce. About the drinking. About why the first marriage ended. I felt dizzy. My ears rang. I looked at my husband, waiting for him to deny it properly, to explain. He didn't. He looked at his phone. He looked at the floor. He looked anywhere but at me. That was the moment everything inside me finally aligned. The coldness. The neglect. The control. I wasn't failing as a wife. I had been carefully chosen to stay quiet where another woman had escaped. My mother pulled me close, her hand resting protectively over my stomach. My father stood up and told my husband calmly that I wasn't going anywhere until my health and safety were guaranteed. For the first time since my marriage began, someone spoke for me, and my silence was no longer the weakest thing in the room. After that day, nothing returned to how it was before. My husband left my parents' house quietly, without argument, without apology. He said he would talk later and walked out like someone who had misplaced something, not like someone who had just been exposed. The door closed behind him, and with it, a chapter of my life ended without ceremony. The days that followed were heavy but clear. My parents didn't rush me. They didn't tell me what to do. They simply stayed close, as if their presence alone could rebuild what had been worn down inside me. I went back to the doctor. This time, my mother sat beside me. The doctor spoke seriously about stress, about how my body was reacting, about how fragile everything had become. I listened carefully, my hand resting on my stomach, realizing how close I had come to losing more than myself. Messages began arriving from my husband's family. First polite. Then irritated. Then accusing. My mother-in-law said I had misunderstood everything. That families have secrets. That the past should stay buried. His sister said I was creating drama and harming my unborn child with negativity. My husband said I was embarrassing him. None of them asked how I was. What hurt most was not the anger in their words, but the familiarity of it. I had heard these same accusations before, just softer, quieter, wrapped in smiles. Now that I was no longer under their roof, they didn't bother hiding it. Night, I lay awake thinking about the woman who came before me. The first wife. I imagined her confusion, her fear, her slow realization that something was wrong. I wondered how long it had taken her to leave. I wondered if she had also blamed herself. The thought made my chest ache with a grief that wasn't entirely mine. My husband called one evening, his voice calmer than before. He said we should talk privately. That families shouldn't interfere. That every marriage has flaws. He promised things would change if I came back. I listened silently, the way I always had. When he finished, I asked him one question. Why didn't you tell me the truth? There was a pause. Then irritation. Then silence. He said it didn't matter anymore. That it was old history. That I should stop living in the past. I ended the call without replying. That night, I cried again, but this time, it was different. The tears didn't feel helpless. They felt like mourning. Mourning the version of myself that had believed love meant endurance. Mourning the future I had imagined so carefully. Mourning the marriage I never truly had. My parents sat with me when I told them everything I had kept hidden before. The drinking, the neglect, the nights alone, the fainting, the fear. My father's hands clenched slowly as he listened. My mother wiped her tears silently. When I finished, my father said something that stayed with me. Silence is not patience when it is forced. In the following days, my husband's family tried new tactics. Relatives called to convince me, to remind me of reputation, to warn me about consequences. They spoke as if my life was a negotiation, as if my pain was a misunderstanding that could be corrected if I simply returned and behaved properly, but something inside me had shifted. I no longer felt confused. I felt tired, but awake. One afternoon, as I sat by the window, feeling my child move gently inside me, I understood something clearly for the first time. Staying had been killing me slowly. Leaving had saved me, even if I didn't yet know what came next, and for the first time, the future, uncertain as it was, felt less frightening than the past I had escaped. The calm didn't last long. It never does when control begins to slip. A week after my husband left my parents' house, people I barely recognized started calling. Distant relatives. Family friends. Voices wrapped in concern that quickly turned sharp. They asked why I was staying away, why I was involving my parents, why I was making matters public. Each call felt like an attempt to pull me back into a role I had quietly stepped out of. My mother-in-law came next. She arrived without warning, her face composed, her voice low and controlled. She hugged my mother tightly, praised my father's wisdom, then turned to me with eyes that searched for weakness. She spoke about family honor, about forgiveness, about how men make mistakes and women hold families together. She reminded me of the comforts I had enjoyed, the status I carried as her son's wife. She said pregnancy makes women emotional and that I should not make permanent decisions in a temporary state. I listened without interrupting. I surprised myself with how still I felt. When she finished, I asked her quietly why no one had thought honesty mattered before my marriage. Her expression changed for just a second, barely noticeable, but real. She said the past was complicated. That protecting the family sometimes required difficult choices. That I should be grateful I was now part of something bigger, something bigger. I realized then that in her world, individuals did not exist. Only appearances did. After she left, my body shook uncontrollably. My mother held me while I cried, not from fear this time, but from exhaustion. I was tired of being explained away. Tired of being told what my pain meant by people who had never felt it. That night, my doctor called with test results and spoke carefully about risk, about stress, about how close I was to another collapse if things continued this way. The decision formed quietly after that. Not dramatic, not angry, just clear. My husband tried again. This time, he showed remorse. He said he would stop drinking. He said his family would stay out of our marriage. He said we could move somewhere else. He said everything I had wanted to hear months ago. His words sounded rehearsed, as if someone had coached him through what to say. I asked him if he had ever loved me. He didn't answer immediately. Then he said love grows with time. That was enough. Days later, through careful conversations and gentle persistence, my parents learned more about his first marriage. How it ended quietly. How money settled things. How the woman left with nothing but relief. How the family had decided it was safer to start over than to fix what was broken. I felt sick as the pieces came together. I wasn't unlucky. I was chosen because I was expected to endure. My health worsened again shortly after. One night, the pain became unbearable. The hospital lights were too bright, the sounds too loud. Doctors moved quickly, voices serious. I remember my father gripping my hand tightly, my mother whispering prayers, my own heart racing with fear, not for myself, but for the life inside me. In that sterile room, stripped of pride and pretense, one truth stood taller than all the others. No marriage, no reputation, no family image was worth risking this life. When I was discharged days later, weaker but stable, my parents made a quiet announcement. I would not be returning to that house. Not now. Not ever, unless safety, honesty, and accountability were real, not promised. The reaction was immediate. Accusations, threats, emotional blackmail. But none of it reached me the way it once did. Something in me had finally gone quiet, the part that kept apologizing for existing. As I rested at home, watching sunlight move slowly across the walls, I felt grief for what I had lost. But beneath it was something new. A fragile sense of self. A beginning. The storm wasn't over. I knew that. Truth never leaves without resistance, but for the first time, I was no longer standing alone in it. After the hospital incident, the world seemed to slow down for me. Days blended into each other, measured by medicines, doctor visits, and the quiet routines my mother created to keep me calm. I stayed mostly in one room, near the window, watching life continue outside as if nothing had changed. Inside me, everything had. The calls from my husband stopped for a while. That silence felt intentional, like a pause before the next move. I knew his family well enough now to understand that they never let go easily. Control, once challenged, always tries to return in a different form. It started with concern. A relative called my mother to say my husband was unwell. Drinking too much. Not eating. Blaming himself. Another said he was depressed because I had left without explanation. They spoke as if I were the cause of his suffering, as if my absence had created his habits rather than exposed them. I listened from the other room, my heart heavy but steady. Guilt tried to rise again, familiar and sharp, but it didn't take hold the way it used to. One evening, my husband finally came himself. He looked different. Tired. Unshaven. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for him. He sat across from me, his voice low, his tone softer than I had ever heard. He said he missed me, that the house felt empty, that he hadn't realized how much I did until I was gone. He apologized, not fully, not clearly, but enough to sound sincere if you wanted to believe it. I wanted to believe it once. I didn't anymore. He spoke about starting fresh, about forgetting the past, about raising our child together. As he talked, I noticed how carefully he avoided certain words. Drinking, divorce, lies, responsibility. It was as if those things didn't exist unless spoken aloud. I asked him if he had told his family the truth yet. His face tightened. He said it wasn't necessary. That family matters should stay private. That involving others only made things worse. I realized then that nothing had changed. He wasn't asking me to return to a safer life. He was asking me to return to silence. I told him I needed time. That answer frustrated him more than anger would have. He stood up abruptly, reminding me of everything his family had done for me. The house, the name, the security. He warned me gently, too gently, that people talk, that reputations suffer, that my child would one day ask questions. After he left, my hands shook for a long time. Fear still lived in me, but it no longer ruled me. I told my parents everything he had said. My father listened carefully, then made another quiet decision. He contacted a lawyer. The word scared me at first. It made everything feel final, heavy, real. But the lawyer spoke calmly, asking simple questions, explaining options without pressure. For the first time, someone talked about my life in terms of rights instead of sacrifices. In the days that followed, I learned how carefully my husband's life had been protected before me. How his first divorce was erased from records where possible. How agreements were signed. How silence was purchased. I learned that my confusion, my isolation, my self-doubt were not accidents. They were consequences of a system designed to protect him at any cost. Some nights, I lay awake thinking about what could have been if truth had existed from the start. I grieved quietly for that imaginary life. Other nights, I felt my child move and reminded myself why I had to keep going. One afternoon, a message arrived from an unknown number. It was short. Just a sentence. I was married to him before you. I left to survive. My breath caught as I read it again and again. My fingers trembled as I typed back, unsure of what to say. When she replied, her words were careful, distant, but unmistakably real. She didn't tell me everything. She didn't need to. Her silence spoke louder than explanations ever could. For the first time, I knew I wasn't imagining anything, and for the first time, I felt a strange kind of strength growing inside me. Not loud, not brave, but steady. Like something that had been buried for a long time and had finally found air. After that message, sleep became difficult again, but this time, it wasn't fear keeping me awake. It was clarity, the kind that settles slowly and refuses to leave. I reread her words again and again, tracing meaning between the lines. I left to survive, not to win, not to destroy, just to live. I wondered how long it had taken her to reach that decision, and how close she had come to losing herself before she did. I replied carefully, afraid of opening wounds that had already healed. I told her I was pregnant. I told her I had left his house. She didn't respond immediately. When she finally did, her message was short and heavy. She told me to protect myself, to trust my body when it says something is wrong. To never let anyone convince me that pain is normal. That night, I cried quietly, not because I was breaking, but because something inside me finally felt understood. The next morning, my husband's family changed their approach. The calls stopped. The messages softened. Suddenly, everyone wanted peace, compromise, understanding. They suggested counseling, mediation, private discussions. They spoke as if the problem was miscommunication, not years of deception. I watched it unfold from a distance, feeling strangely detached, like someone observing a storm from behind glass. My mother asked me what I wanted. The question startled me. For so long, my wants had been buried under expectations that I had forgotten how to hear them. I closed my eyes and listened inwardly. I wanted safety. I wanted honesty. I wanted to breathe without fear. Saying it out loud felt unfamiliar, but freeing. The lawyer explained things gently. Custody. Separation. Rights. He didn't push me toward any decision. He simply laid the truth out plainly, something no one in my marriage had ever done. I realized how powerful truth could be when it wasn't twisted to serve someone else. My health stabilized slowly. The doctors were careful but hopeful. I followed instructions this time. I rested. I ate. I stopped apologizing for needing care. My body responded, not immediately, but enough to remind me that healing was possible. One afternoon, my husband sent a long message. He said he felt betrayed, that he never expected me to involve lawyers, that he thought I was different from the first woman, more patient, more understanding. That sentence stayed with me longer than anything else he wrote. Different. Not loved. Not valued. Just quieter. I didn't reply. Days later, his mother called my father directly. Her tone was sharp now, stripped of politeness. She accused him of poisoning my mind, of breaking a home. My father listened calmly and then said something that ended the conversation. Homes built on lies collapse on their own, he told her. We didn't push it. The silence that followed was final. At night, I started writing things down. Small memories. Comments. Incidents. Patterns. Not to use against anyone, but to make sense of myself. To remind myself that this wasn't sudden. That I hadn't imagined it. Each page felt like reclaiming a piece of my voice. Sometimes, doubt crept in. What if things could have changed? What if I had tried harder? But then my body would ache or my child would move, and I would remember the hospital lights, the fear, the way my husband had looked away when truth was spoken. Doubt faded faster now. I didn't know what the future held. I only knew this. I was no longer willing to disappear quietly so others could stay comfortable, and somewhere inside me, beneath all the trauma and exhaustion, something steady had begun to take root. Not anger, not revenge, resolve. Resolve is quiet. It doesn't announce itself. It sits with you in silence, waiting for fear to finish speaking. In the days that followed, I felt it settle into my bones. I still cried sometimes. I still woke up at night with my heart racing. But underneath all of that, something had changed. I was no longer confused about what was happening to me. My husband tried once more, this time through my emotions. He sent voice notes instead of texts. His voice sounded tired, almost broken. He said he was drinking less. He said the house felt empty without me. He said our child deserved both parents. He didn't say sorry. He didn't explain the lies. He spoke as if time itself would erase everything if I just returned. I listened to every message fully. I wanted to be sure. When he finished, I realized something painful but clear. He missed control, not me. He missed the version of me that stayed quiet, adjusted quickly, and absorbed discomfort without complaint. The woman I was becoming frightened him. I asked him one last question over text. I asked if he was willing to admit the truth openly to me, to our families, to himself. Hours passed. Then a short reply came. Why drag the past into this? That was my answer. Around that time, my health took another turn, not dramatic, but serious enough to remind everyone how fragile things still were. The doctor warned us again, stressing that emotional stress could not be separated from physical consequences anymore. I saw my mother's face tighten as she listened. My father stood closer to me, his hand resting protectively on my shoulder. That evening, they made a decision with me, not for me. They said they would support whatever path I chose. But they also said they would never allow me to be pushed back into a situation that had already nearly destroyed me. Hearing that lifted a weight I didn't realize I was still carrying. News began to spread quietly among relatives. Not accusations, just facts. That my husband had been married before. That it ended badly. That I had fallen ill during pregnancy. That I was now staying with my parents under medical advice. The story changed shape as it moved, but the truth stayed intact enough to weaken the narrative his family had protected for years. Some people reacted with shock. Some with sympathy. Some with silence. I learned quickly who mattered. One afternoon, I received another message from the woman who came before me. She told me she was glad I had left. She said she had once wished someone had stopped her from going back when she still believed things could change. Her words didn't comfort me. They strengthened me. They reminded me that survival sometimes looks like walking away without closure. The legal process moved slowly, carefully. Papers. Meetings. Conversations I never thought I would have. It was exhausting, but it was honest. For the first time, my life was being discussed without lies filling the gaps. At night, I talked to my child quietly. I promise safety. I promise truth. I promised that whatever the future looked like, it would not be built on silence and fear. Saying those words felt like a vow to both of us. There were moments I missed the idea of marriage. The image I had once held so tightly. But I no longer missed the man I had lived with. That distinction mattered more than anything else. I was no longer waiting for someone to save me. I had already stepped into the act of saving myself. By the time the legal conversations became unavoidable. My body had learned to recognize danger before my mind could explain it. Each message from my husband's side tightened my chest. Each mention of reconciliation drained my energy. My doctor noticed it immediately and warned me again that stress was no longer just an emotional issue. It had become physical. That warning changed how my parents moved forward. They stopped responding to unnecessary calls. They redirected all communication through the lawyer. The boundary felt strange at first, almost rude, but it brought an unexpected peace. For the first time in months, no one was asking me to explain myself. No one was pressuring me to forgive, adjust, or compromise. My husband reacted badly. He accused me of being influenced, of turning cold, of punishing him. His messages shifted from pleading to blaming within hours. He said I was destroying his image. He reminded me of what society does to women who leave. He hinted that my child would suffer without a complete family. I read every word carefully. I felt the familiar guilt try to rise again, but it couldn't breathe in the presence of clarity. These were not the words of someone seeking healing. They were the words of someone losing control. Around that time, the truth about his first marriage surfaced more openly. Not through shouting or exposure, but through consistency. The same details emerging from different people. The drinking, the affairs, the emotional neglect, the quiet settlement, the silence purchased. Each confirmation felt like a nail sealing the coffin of doubt I had carried for so long. I stopped questioning my memory. I stopped rewriting my pain to make it acceptable. One evening, my father told me something that made me sit upright. He said my husband's family had contacted him privately, offering compromises. Money, property, agreements, anything to keep things quiet. The offer wasn't insulting, it was revealing. It confirmed everything I needed to know about their priorities. I felt sick, not because of the offer, but because of how normal it seemed to them. My parents refused politely, firmly, without negotiation. That night, I realized something important. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was about patterns that had survived because no one challenged them. This was about women being expected to absorb damage so others could remain comfortable. And this was about my child growing up knowing that truth matters more than image. My health fluctuated, but it no longer spiraled. I followed routines carefully. I allowed myself rest without guilt. I noticed small improvements. Stronger breaths. Quieter nights. Less fear when the phone rang. One afternoon, I stepped outside alone for the first time in weeks. The air felt different. Cleaner. I walked slowly, my hand on my stomach, feeling life move within me. I realized that this child had never known the house where I had suffered. Their world had begun here in safety. That thought brought tears to my eyes. I wasn't free yet. The storm hadn't passed. But I was standing on solid ground now, no longer sinking. Each truth spoken, each boundary held, strengthened that ground beneath my feet. The past was no longer a shadow chasing me. It was a lesson standing behind me, and for the first time, I wasn't afraid of what came next. By then, the house I grew up in had begun to feel like a place of rebuilding rather than escape. My room slowly filled with quiet routines, medicine on the side table, notes from doctors, more meals my mother prepared without asking what I wanted, because she already knew. These small, ordinary acts stitched something back together inside me. Not all at once, but enough to remind me that care did not have to hurt. The outside world, however, had not finished reacting. Rumors began to shift shape. At first, people whispered that I was too weak to handle marriage. Then they said I had been manipulated by my parents. Later, some admitted they had always suspected something was wrong but never dared to say it. I listened to all of it with a strange calm. I had learned that people speak most loudly when they are unsure what to believe. My husband sent one final message that felt different from the rest. It was not angry. It was not pleading. It was calculated. He said he would tell people his version of the story if I didn't return soon. He said he would protect himself however he needed to. Reading it, I felt no panic, only disappointment. Even now, truth was optional to him. The lawyer advised patience. He said consistency matters more than reaction. That silence, when chosen freely, can be powerful. I followed that advice. I stopped engaging. I stopped defending. I let facts speak through action rather than argument. Around this time, something unexpected happened. A relative from his side reached out quietly, not to accuse, but to apologize. She said she hadn't known everything before, that she saw now how carefully the family controlled narratives. Her message didn't erase the damage, but it confirmed something important. The truth, once loosened, does not stay contained. My body continued its slow recovery. The baby grew stronger. Each heartbeat during checkups felt like a promise being kept. I started imagining a future again, Not in detail, not in certainty, but with permission. I allowed myself to think about who I might become outside the boundaries that had once defined me. One evening, I sat with my parents and spoke about separation out loud for the first time without shaking. The word no longer terrified me. It felt heavy, yes, but also honest. We talked about practical things. Support. Time. Healing. My parents didn't rush the conversation. They didn't turn it into a victory or a failure. They treated it like what it was, a necessary step towards safety. That night, I dreamed of water. Not drowning this time. Floating. I woke up with my hand on my stomach, breathing steadily, feeling something I hadn't felt in months, trust in myself. Messages from my husband's family became sporadic. Short. Careful. The urgency had faded. They were adjusting to the idea that I was no longer accessible in the ways they were used to. Control loses its grip when it no longer finds fear. I thought often of the woman before me. I wished she had been protected the way I was now. I wished I could tell her that her leaving had not been in vain, that it had planted a seed of truth that eventually reached me. I didn't feel brave. I still don't. But I felt awake, and sometimes that is the most powerful state of all. By the time winter arrived, the noise around my life had softened into a dull echo. Not because people stopped talking, but because their words no longer reached the places inside me where fear used to live. I moved slowly now, carefully, listening to my body in a way I never had before. Every small ache reminded me how close I had come to losing myself. Every calm morning felt like a quiet victory. My husband sent legal notice through his lawyer soon after. The language was formal, distant, stripped of emotion. Reading it felt strange, like looking at evidence from a life that no longer belonged to me. He wanted terms, conditions, timelines, control, even now, framed as cooperation. I handed the papers to my father and went back to my room without comment. I no longer needed to read every word to understand the intent behind them. What surprised me most was how little anger I felt. There was sadness, yes. There was grief for the woman I had been when I believed love could survive neglect. But rage never came. In its place was a steady awareness. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not bad luck. This was a pattern I had stepped out of in time. As my pregnancy advanced, my world became smaller and clearer. Doctor visits. Short walks. Long conversations with my mother late at night. Sometimes she spoke. Sometimes we sat in silence. That silence felt different now, chosen, warm, protective. Not the kind that erased you. One afternoon, while sorting through old documents, my father found something that made his hands tremble slightly. A copy of an agreement tied to my husband's first divorce. The language was careful. Cold. It confirmed everything we already knew. The conditions. The secrecy. The money exchanged for silence. Seeing it in writing didn't shock me. It grounded me. This wasn't intuition anymore. It was fact. I held the paper for a long time, feeling the weight of how close I had come to becoming another erased chapter. That night, I spoke to my child again, quietly, the way I always did before sleeping. I told them about honesty. About choosing safety even when it disappoints others. About how strength isn't loud and survival isn't shameful. My voice didn't shake as I spoke. That felt important. The outside world began to accept what it could no longer deny. Invitations stopped coming. Questions slowed. Some people withdrew entirely. Others approached cautiously, offering sympathy without asking for details. I learned that distance can be a form of respect when it's finally given. My husband tried once more to meet privately. He said closure mattered. I thought about it for a long time before saying no. Not out of fear. Out of clarity. Closure does not require proximity. Sometimes it only requires acceptance. As the days passed, I noticed something simple and profound. I laughed more easily. I slept deeper. I no longer rehearsed conversations in my head before speaking. The constant tension I had lived with for so long had loosened its grip. I wasn't healed. Not completely. Trauma doesn't vanish because you choose better. But I was no longer bleeding invisibly for the comfort of others. For the first time since my marriage began, my life felt like it belonged to me again. As my due date drew closer, time began to feel fragile. like something I needed to hold carefully. Every appointment, every quiet morning, carried a weight I had never known before. The doctors were cautious but hopeful. They reminded me often that my body had been under stress for too long, that healing would take patience. I listened closely now. I no longer treated my body like something I had to push through pain to prove my worth. The legal process moved into a phase that felt heavier than the rest. Dates were discussed, documents prepared. Words like separation and custody appeared on paper, printed in ink that felt too permanent. Some nights, I stared at those papers until the letters blurred. Ending something, even something that had harmed me, felt like mourning a death that had already happened long ago. My husband reacted poorly when he realized reconciliation was no longer an option. His messages grew colder. He accused me of calculation, of waiting for the right moment to leave. The irony of that accusation almost made me laugh. If survival looks like planning, then yes, I had planned to stay alive. His family stopped pretending. They no longer spoke of forgiveness or unity. Instead, they spoke of loss, of embarrassment, of what they had invested. I understood then that to them, I was never a person in pain. I was a role that had refused to perform. One evening, a message came from his sister. It was short and sharp. She said I had ruined everything, that I had broken a home, that if I had been stronger, things would have worked. I read it once and deleted it without replying. Strength, I had learned, is not measured by how much damage you can endure in silence. My parents stood firm through it all. They attended meetings with me, asked questions when my voice felt tired, reminded me gently that I could pause whenever I needed. I saw the toll this had taken on them too, the worry, the sleepless nights, the quiet anger they never showed me. Their support wasn't loud. It was constant. And that constancy saved me more than once. As the final weeks approached, I began to feel a mix of fear and anticipation that had nothing to do with my marriage. I focused on preparing for the child who would soon arrive. Tiny clothes folded neatly, a cradle placed near my bed. These simple acts grounded me in the present, reminding me that life continues even when chapters end painfully. One night, unable to sleep, I sat by the window watching the city lights flicker. I thought about the woman I had been when I entered that marriage, hopeful, trusting, unaware. I felt tenderness for her, not shame. She had done the best she could with what she knew. That realization softened something inside me that I hadn't realized was still hardened. The lawyer called a few days later to say things were moving toward resolution. Not quickly, not easily, but steadily. Hearing that brought an unexpected calm. There was no dramatic relief, no celebration. Just the sense that I was finally walking forward instead of standing still. I placed my hand over my stomach and felt a strong, steady movement. Life, insisting on itself. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine telling this story one day, not as a confession filled with pain, but as a reminder that survival can be quiet and still be powerful. The day my child was born, the world narrowed down to a single, overwhelming moment. Pain, fear, and exhaustion blurred together until nothing else existed. And then, suddenly, there was a sound small, sharp, alive. I remember crying, not because of the pain, but because I had made it through something I once believed would break me completely. My parents were there when I woke up. My mother held my hand. My father stood quietly near the door, his eyes softer than I had ever seen them. For a brief moment, everything else disappeared. The past, the conflict, the fear. All that mattered was the tiny life placed gently against my chest. I had worried about many things during my pregnancy. I had worried about doing this alone, about strength, about survival. But in that moment, I felt something I hadn't expected: peace. Fragile, yes, but real. News of the birth reached my husband quickly. He sent a message asking if the baby was healthy. It was the first time he had asked that question. I stared at the screen for a long time before replying with a single word. Yes. I didn't add anything else. I didn't need to. His family reacted differently. Some sent congratulations filled with formality. Others remained silent. I felt no urge to fill that silence. The absence of their voices felt like space to breathe, to heal, to begin again. The weeks that followed were difficult in quiet ways. Sleepless nights, physical recovery, emotional waves that came without warning. Some days, grief returned unexpectedly. I mourned the idea of a shared beginning I had once imagined for my child. Other days, gratitude overwhelmed me for my parents, for my body, for the fact that we were safe. The legal process continued in the background, but it no longer consumed me. It had become something separate from my identity. A necessary step, not the center of my life. That distinction mattered. One afternoon, my husband asked to see the baby. The request stirred something deep inside me, not anger, not fear, but caution. I didn't refuse immediately. I asked for time. I wanted to make decisions now from a place of stability, not obligation. I thought about the years ahead, about boundaries, about truth, about what kind of environment my child would grow up in. I knew that whatever choices I made next would shape more than just my own healing. As I held my child in the quiet hours of early morning, I whispered promises I intended to keep. That love would not come with fear. That silence would not be used as punishment. That home would be a place of safety, not survival. Outside, the world continued as it always had. People moved on. Stories faded. But inside me, something fundamental had shifted. I no longer measured my worth by endurance. I measured it by the life I protected. The past still existed. It always would. But it no longer defined me. For the first time, the future didn't feel like something I had to brace myself against. It felt like something I could step into slowly, carefully, but without apology. Motherhood changed the way I experienced time. Days no longer rushed past me in anxious fragments. They unfolded slowly, shaped by feeding schedules, soft cries, and the steady rhythm of a tiny heartbeat against my chest. In those quiet hours, I began to understand something I hadn't before, how deeply I had lived in fear, and how unfamiliar peace felt when it finally arrived. My husband's request to see the baby didn't disappear. It returned carefully, wrapped in politeness and restraint. He said he only wanted a moment, that he deserved to know his child. The word deserved lingered in my mind long after I read it. I wondered when entitlement had replaced responsibility in his vocabulary, and how easily those two had been confused for him all his life. I spoke to the lawyer again. We talked about boundaries, about supervised meetings, about conditions that protected my child before honoring anyone else's expectations. I realized how much strength there was in preparation. It wasn't cold. It wasn't cruel. It was conscious. My parents supported every step. They didn't rush me. They didn't pressure me to forgive or refuse. They trusted me to know what felt right, and that trust felt like a gift I was still learning how to carry. Eventually, I agreed to a brief meeting on my terms. Neutral place, limited time, clear rules. When the day came, my hands trembled slightly as I held my child, not from fear of him, but from the weight of finality. Some doors, once opened again, never closed the same way. He arrived looking different than before. Quieter. Smaller somehow. When he saw the baby, something shifted in his expression, surprise, perhaps, or recognition. He reached out hesitantly, then pulled his hand back. I watched him carefully, noticing how unfamiliar uncertainty looked on him. He spoke about regret, about mistakes, about wanting to be better. His words were softer than I remembered, but they still avoided the truth. He didn't speak of lies. He didn't speak of the past. He spoke as if change could exist without acknowledgement. I listened without interruption. When the time ended, I stood up calmly and said we would discuss future arrangements through the lawyer. He looked stunned, as if he had expected emotion to soften the moment. I realized then that control had always relied on my reactions. Without them, it had nowhere to land. After that day, something settled inside me. The meeting didn't reopen wounds the way I had feared. Instead, it confirmed what I already knew. I was no longer living in the shadow of what he wanted. I was living in alignment with what my child needed. The legal conversations moved closer to resolution. Agreements formed slowly, carefully, with safeguards that reflected reality rather than illusion. There were moments of resistance from his side, but less than before. I sensed fatigue there. Resistance weakens when it is met with consistency instead of chaos. At home, life continued quietly. My mother sang to the baby while cooking. My father held them gently in the evenings, his presence steady and grounding. I watched these moments and felt something like grief mixed with gratitude. This was the family I had needed all along. One night, as I rocked my child to sleep, I caught my reflection in the mirror. I looked tired, older, changed, but I also looked present, whole in a way I hadn't been before. The woman staring back at me wasn't waiting for permission anymore. I understood then that healing wasn't about forgetting. It was about choosing again and again not to return to places that required you to disappear. As weeks passed, the tension that once dominated every thought slowly lost its grip. Not because everything had been resolved, but because I had learned how to live without waiting for resolution to feel whole. Life didn't pause while legal papers moved or conversations ended halfway. It continued in feedings, in late-night rocking, in the way my child's fingers wrapped instinctively around mine. The outside world tried once more to intrude. Relatives from my husband's side reached out again, this time with carefully chosen words. They spoke about compromise, about the child's future, about how bitterness poisons families. I listened politely and said nothing. I had learned by now that explanations invite arguments, and arguments only benefit those who want to blur the truth. One message arrived that unsettled me more than the rest. My mother-in-law wrote that she wanted to meet the baby, not to discuss anything else, just to see her grandchild. The request sounded simple, harmless even. But I knew how simplicity had been used before, to step past boundaries while pretending not to see them. I took time before responding. Days passed. I spoke to my parents, to the lawyer. I asked myself hard questions. Was this about generosity or pressure? About healing or image? In the end, I realized something important. Boundaries are not punishments. They are protections. And protections don't require justification. I declined the meeting, politely and firmly. The reaction was immediate. Accusations resurfaced. Claims of cruelty. Warnings about how children grow up resentful when cut off from their people. I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, but it loosened just as quickly. These words had once owned me. Now, they passed through without settling. Around that time, the legal agreement was finalized. There was no dramatic courtroom scene, no victory speech, just signatures on paper, witnessed and recorded. I sat quietly as it happened, my child asleep in my arms, unaware that something significant had just shifted beneath their future. When it was done, I felt an unexpected wave of grief. Not for my husband, but for the version of my life I had once believed in so completely. I let myself feel it. Fully. Without shame. That night, after everyone slept, I stood by the window and looked out at the city lights. I thought about the girl I had been when I walked into that marriage, convinced that endurance was love. I wished I could reach back through time and hold her hand. Tell her that silence would not save her. That leaving would not destroy her. That strength would arrive quietly, one choice at a time. The next morning, I woke up lighter. Not happy in the simple sense, but unburdened. My husband sent a final message acknowledging the agreement. It was short, neutral, almost relieved. I realized then that this ending, quiet as it was, suited him too. Conflict requires accountability. Distance does not. Life settled into a new rhythm. Friends visited. Laughter returned in small bursts. I started thinking about the future again, not in grand plans, but in possibilities. Education. Work. Stability. A life where my child would never learn to confuse fear with love. One afternoon, as I held my child close, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel before: pride. Not the loud kind. The steady kind that comes from surviving without becoming cruel. The past no longer chased me. It walked behind me, contained and understood, and ahead of me, the road was open. Closure did not arrive the way I once imagined it would. There was no final confrontation, no moment where everyone suddenly understood what they had done. Instead, closure came in fragments, in ordinary days that passed without fear, in decisions made calmly, in the absence of chaos where it once lived constantly. The world adjusted slowly. People who had once whispered stopped asking questions. New conversations formed that had nothing to do with my past. I noticed how rarely my husband crossed my mind now. When he did, it was without anger, without longing, just acknowledgement. Like remembering a road you once traveled and would never choose again, I returned to small pieces of myself that had been set aside for years. Reading, writing, thinking without anxiety. I began to imagine returning to work one day, not as an escape, but as expression. The idea felt distant but possible. Possibility had returned to my life quietly, without ceremony. My child grew stronger every day. Each smile, each sound, felt like confirmation that leaving had been the right choice. I watched closely, determined to build a world where curiosity would never be punished, where love would never require silence. I learned that healing is not a destination, it's a way of moving through life. Occasionally, messages from my husband's side still appeared. Not requests, not demands, just updates, formal and distant. I responded when necessary, through proper channels, without emotion. That distance protected us both. One afternoon, while sorting old papers, I found a photograph from my wedding day. I held it for a long time. I didn't feel pain. I felt compassion for the woman in the picture, smiling with hope she didn't yet know was misplaced. I didn't tear the photo. I didn't hide it. I placed it back gently, acknowledging its place in my story without letting it define the rest. A relative told me later that my husband had started drinking again. The news reached me like background noise. I felt sadness, but no responsibility. Change cannot be carried by someone else's spine. It must come from within, or not at all. My parents noticed the difference in me before I did. They said my voice sounded steadier, that I laughed without hesitation, that I no longer apologized for existing. I realized then how deeply I had been trained to minimize myself and how powerful it felt to stop. One evening, sitting quietly after putting my child to sleep, I wrote a letter I never intended to send. I wrote to my husband, not to accuse, but to release. I told him that I hoped he would one day choose honesty, that I forgave him, not for his sake, but because carrying resentment would tie me to a past I had already outgrown. When I finished, I folded the letter and placed it away unsent. Forgiveness does not require permission. The next morning, sunlight filled the room as I held my child close. I felt grounded in a way I had never known before. Not because life was perfect, but because it was honest. I understood then that survival had taught me something deeper than endurance. It had taught me discernment, the ability to recognize what nurtures you and what slowly destroys you, and that knowledge, once learned, cannot be unlearned. The end of my story did not feel like an ending at all. It felt like a settling, like dust finally falling after a long storm. Life did not suddenly become easy, but it became mine in a way it never had before. I woke up each day knowing where I stood, knowing that no one would pull the ground from beneath my feet without my consent. Motherhood reshaped me in quiet ways. It softened parts of me that had grown rigid with fear, and strengthened parts one didn't know existed. As I watched my child sleep, I often thought about the kind of world I wanted to build for them. Not a perfect one, just an honest one. A place where love would never feel like a test, and silence would never be demanded as proof of loyalty. People still asked questions sometimes. Why didn't I try harder? Why didn't I wait longer? Why didn't I forgive sooner? I learned to let those questions pass without answering. Explanations are exhausting, and I no longer owed anyone my pain translated into language they found comfortable. What mattered was this: I had chosen safety over appearance, truth over tradition, life over endurance. There were days I still felt the weight of what I had lost. Marriage carries dreams, even when it fails. I allowed myself to grieve those dreams without turning that grief into regret. Missing what could have been does not mean you should return to what was harming you. That distinction became one of the most important lessons of my life. I thought often of the women who never get the chance to leave. The ones who stay because fear is louder than hope. I didn't see myself as brave, but I understood now how easily silence can be mistaken for strength, and how often survival is dismissed as weakness. If my story held any meaning beyond me, I hoped it was this: leaving is not failure. Staying and disappearing is point one afternoon. As my child learned to hold their head up on their own, I laughed out loud. The sound surprised me. It came from somewhere deep, unforced, free. In that moment, I realized how far I had come from a woman who whispered apologies for existing to one who could laugh without fear of being corrected. The past did not vanish. It never does. But it lost its power to control my future. I carried it with awareness, not shame. With understanding, not bitterness. I don't know what lies years ahead. Life will bring challenges again. I'm not naive enough to believe otherwise. But I know this. Whatever comes next will meet a woman who knows her worth, who listens to her instincts, and who will never again confuse endurance with love. If someone ever asks me how I survived, I won't say I was strong. I'll say I was honest with myself for the first time, and sometimes that is all it takes to change everything.